Darrell Huffman, and I am 64 years old. I grew up in a little California town, a small junction yard on the SP. When I stepped out my back door, I would actually step out onto the railroad property itself. That yard was my playground. My childhood days were spent climbing on boxcars, much like most kids spend climbing trees. It's a little small desert town. In the 1950s, steam was still in power. Locomotives shuffling back and forth were almost always steam locomotives, mainly moguls and consolidations. Never saw any passenger trains. There was no fast freights ever come through. Only local runs, stopping and picking up a car here and dropping off a car there. Of course, as a kid, I was always fascinated by those monstrous locomotives. I remember the compressors sighing and groaning. I remember hissing steam, and I remember water condensing and dripping off all kinds of different parts of the locomotive. Black paint was caked on. You could tell that they had just taken a brush and brushed on layer after layer of black paint to hide the old dirty cracked paint. That paint was further cracked and destroyed by the heat of the locomotive itself, of course, but also because it was out in the desert. In 110, 115 degree weather, that paint would really weather quickly. I was able to climb all over the locomotives. Of course, when I'd get a little too nosy and get a little too close, particularly if I got down around the valve gear or the drivers, well, the engineer would generally blow off some steam to brush me back. Of course, that was only temporary. Soon I was right back, sticking my nose into everything. That was over 50 years ago, but the memories are still fresh in my mind. It seemed natural for me to be a model railroader, but none of my childhood friends were, only me. So I guess I was the only one who was truly captivated by the beauty and power of those creations. I've brought the passion that I had for those living machines into my hobby, always trying to capture the look and feel of those long gone days. Part of that desire to recreate what I knew back then involves the correct colors and weathering of all the elements in that scene. And foremost in that scene, of course, were the locomotives themselves. So what we're going to talk about today is how I have weathered my own locomotives over the past 50 years of model railroading. We'll skip my early days of poorly weathered locomotives and concentrate on how I do weathering today. But before we begin, let me say that there's no hard and fast rules about how you should do things. Talk to 5 different model railroaders, and you're going to get 5 different opinions about how things should be done. So this is not a video on what you have to do or what you should do, but rather it is simply an expression of how I do things. Take what you like from this video and discard anything you don't like. So drag up a chair, look over my shoulder as we begin.
The only possible way to realistically weather a locomotive is to know what the original locomotive looked like as it was being used in service. When the locomotive was new, it was shiny, jet black. But that uniform jet black color soon began to fade as dirt and grime accumulated on it. Carbon and soot from the smokestack, plus the carbon and soot from the atmosphere of the early industrial age, settled on the locomotive. Rain and snow then worked that soot into various crooks and crannies, where it would blend with dirt and other colors to create an endless variety of colors and textures. As time went on, heat from the boiler and firebox would cause the paint to bake and change color and texture. Elements carried in the steam and in the water would condense and flow and drip into every corner. And of course rust began to corrode and break down the metal itself as soon as it was exposed to air. The paint would shrink and crack and lift off the metal. Chips would appear through use, and the surface of the paint would quickly wear away where the fireman and the engineer would walk and handle and touch the paint. Different metals like brass were used in different areas, such as bells and handles for valves. Copper was often used for fittings and pipes. While we think of locomotives as being jet black, all of these different colors and textures and materials would blend to produce a locomotive that reflected its construction and use and the territory it was operated in. This tremendous variety of colors and hues would bring a living, breathing machine that was anything but jet black to life. So to accurately model and weather a locomotive that was in service, we have to think about all the factors that would provide that weathering and then try our best to duplicate that weathering. But where do we begin? If we had a time machine, we could just go back 50 or 100 years and look and feel and touch the actual locomotives themselves. But we can't do that, of course. So what do? Well, we can do research. We should learn about the weather conditions and the type of soil in the areas our locomotives operated in. We can find books and dig through those books of photographs of the kind of locomotives we're modeling. Unfortunately, if you want to find good color photos of the consolidations used on the Goshen branch of the Southern Pacific in 1940, you're probably going to waste a lot of time and ultimately be disappointed, as good color photos from those days of the actual locomotive you're interested in may not exist at all. So do the next best thing. Find photos of other similar engines to work with. Or we can take advantage of the wonderful collection of photos available today of working locomotives on tourist lines in operation. We are fortunate that color photography had been invented in time to preserve our rich railroad heritage in both print and in movies. There's a huge amount of books and photos in print and on the internet that can help us in our efforts to produce accurate scale models today. Of course, there's too many publishers to mention them all, but I find the books of color photos published by BHI Publications to be extremely valuable resources for my modeling. The staff of BHI Publications include my friends Tim Molina, Rick Blanchard, Mike Conder, Cameron Turner, Maury Walker, and Todd Leftwich. All are expert photographers who have joined forces to provide the modeler with a tremendous collection of high-quality, detailed, close-up photos of locomotives and rolling stock in use today. The books from BHI Publications are my personal favorites, and the people at BHI have given me permission to use their books and photos in this video clinic. And that's what you've been looking at, is photos from this particular book that you're looking at on the screen now. So we're going to use these books and photos for reference materials in this video clinic on weathering. But before we begin, let's talk about black locomotives. As you watch this locomotive roll by, notice instead of being black, it's a multitude of different grays. So on our models, while they come black, and we're tempted to paint them black and weather them black, as we look at this locomotive again, notice that instead of being jet black, it's really a large collection of different shades of gray. The first locomotive we're going to weather is an HO scale C&O 260 from IHC. When we look at this model, we see it's like so many HO scale locomotives. The handrails is chrome-plated wire. The stanchions, chrome-plated. The drive rods, chrome-plated. This looks very nice on the dealer shelves, but it's not very realistic. All the photos I've ever seen of this particular style of locomotive on the C&O, the drive rods were actually painted black or very dark gray. Same with the handrails. Now on the leading truck, we can see that it's painted well. When we look at the rest of the locomotive, we're going to recognize there's things that we need to paint, particularly here on the Tinder Trucks. Here, instead of being black, the whole wheel is chrome, so we want to paint that for sure. We're going to be using Tester's Flat Black and Tester's Gunship Gray for our weathering here. Just need small amounts. We want to mix just in the lid of the cap. Going to be using a little bit of this gray, and we're going to be using a lot of thinner. But to start with, we're going to paint those wheels on the Tinder. Just a small brush, put the paint on the wheel, and just rotate the wheel like this, and that gets your paint down onto the part of the wheel that shows. We don't worry about the inside. We want to make sure we don't get paint out where the wheel actually makes contact with the track. If that happens, we come back later and we clean it up a little bit. We clean it up with an emery board like I'm doing here after it dries. Just give it a few swipes, and that's all there is to it. And then of course we want to brush off any little bits of paint that have flaked off. Very easily done. Now when we're weathering this locomotive, we don't want to make it heavily weathered. This is going to be lightly weathered. So we're going to deal a lot with washes. But we're going to start by painting the handrails and these other places we've talked about with the flat black paint. So just working with a small brush and working along, just paint the handrails on all sides, so instead of chrome showing, it's flat black. I want to do it from this side and then reach over from the other side as well and do that. We're going to do the same thing with the drive rods. Now notice I'm not painting the tips of the rods where they actually join to the wheel. We're going to come back later with Neolube, which is a black graphite suspension that serves as a lubricant but will also stain the metal parts black. So we're just painting the drive rods. Here we're not using the straight flat black, but the gray and black mix. Now we're going to add a little bit of rust to the smoke box, not a lot. So we start with Tester's Rust with a lot of thinner in it. Can you see as I touch that, it just runs right down? And we just want to do just enough. We're not really trying to make it look rusty. We just want it to look something other than plain silver. So we just work it around. If you get too much on, just come back with a dry brush and lift it off. Now we have some little chrome parts on the front, and we want to add a little bit of rust here to the front coupler and the area around the coupler. These get quite a bit of abuse. The factory paint doesn't stay on these long at all. So we're just going to add little bits of rust color here on the front where the pilot gets a certain amount of abuse. Now here again we're going with just the flat gray with a lot of thinner in it. You can't see the thinner, but it's there. So we're just putting tiny amounts. We're actually just going to stain this, and what we're working on is right there is where the brakeman or the fireman climbs up onto the locomotive to assist in putting sand or water into the domes. So this part of the front of the locomotive sees a certain amount of wear, and down here also on the pilot itself. Any of the steps there. Now we're not painting that. That's not a gray paint, but rather it's a stain, a lot of thinner with a little bit of paint. Just have to be very careful in doing that. Again, if you get too much on, if it looks like it's going to be too strong, come back with a dry paintbrush and it'll soak it up. Now here on the running board, you can see I'm putting little dots of this. I've already added the thinner, but then I come back immediately with more thinner. So we just want this wash to go along the running boards on both sides. A little bit of paint, a lot of thinner. I'm just wanting to make a stain, and this obviously is where dirt and grime would collect anyway, plus the fireman or the brakeman would walk along there as well. While we're at it, if we take a little bit of this and just go over this little detail part here, most of the paint will flow right off, but a little bit will stick, just enough to make it look like it's, it'll just add detail to it and bring it out a little bit. Again, just a little tiny bit. Now we're working over on the other side of the locomotive, and we're doing the same thing. We're just adding little tiny bits of paint and a lot of thinner and just moving it around just to show the accumulation of dust. Just something to break up that jet black finish. Because jet black looks like a brand new locomotive, and if you want your locomotives to be brand new, that's great. It's your locomotive. But we're going for a weathered look. And this is pretty mildly weathered. Now here I'm taking some more of that gray. I'm just going across the steam chest here. This area around where the cylinders are, there's a lot of moisture. So we get a certain amount on there. Again, you don't want much. Doing this very lightly. Now it's a little shiny, of course, and looks a little stronger there, but when that dries, that's virtually going to disappear. If you ever put on too much, just remove it with a dry brush and do it again. On the domes, we recognize that the water dome here would get a certain amount of stain, and that stain would run down the side. So we're just putting little bits, not a lot. Very, very thin amounts. We're not going to wash the whole locomotive. We're going to try to keep it black. But we are going to add some stains, just so that we can see that it's been used. Again, look for photographs. There's some really good websites with photographs of C&O locomotives on them, so you can see pretty much how they were weathered. Just small amounts. Now here, these are the steps that the fireman or the brakeman step up on to get up to that sand dome there. So that always shows a little bit of wear. So we want a little bit of concentrated wear there, and right here where they step up from the running boards to get to the dome. Of course, on the stack, there's always going to be a certain amount of stain too. We're just putting a little bit of this light color here, because if I put black on that already black stack, it won't show up at all. So we're just showing a little bit of stain here. Again, we're not putting stain all over the locomotive, and this is very small amounts. Very small amounts. Now in the areas down here, you can put a little bit of stain right on that part of the valve gear. Looking at the front of the locomotive, we're just going to add just a little bit of this stain on the headlight, just to show accumulation of dust. You can use a light tan color for the accumulation of the dust if you like. You know, dirt is different in all parts of the country. Where I grew up in California, dirt was tan, very light tan. Here in Alaska, it's gray. So again, you're just going to have to weather this according to the kind of territory that your railroad ran in. And what we're doing here, of course, we're just showing a variety of techniques and different materials. As we go through these different demonstrations, this is just to give you an idea of how it's applied, what it's going to look like. Adding a little bit of the stain back there in the area of the whistle and the valves there on the top. Just anything to highlight that a little bit. Want to do all this very, very discreetly. Very, very tiny amounts. white deposits from water show up and build up on all parts of the locomotive. Any place where there's water, especially this hot water, which evaporates very quickly, these deposits will build up. When we look in the area of the cab and the tender, we recognize that the engineer and the fireman spend a lot of time right in this area here. So we want to go ahead and stain that. And again, we're just wanting to make it look lighter. If you want, you can paint this silver. You can add some rust here, of course. Put a little bit of the stain also inside the cab. And here, where the crew steps up into the cab, those portions are going to show a lot more dirt and a lot more wear than the surrounding area is. Now here at the back of the tender, same type things. Any place where the brakeman or the fireman step is going to have more wear. That little handle there, they grab hold of that to lift themselves up. A lot of times locomotives have these painted silver. Here we're using black, and we're just putting a little bit of stain on there. And this ladder here that the brakeman or the fireman uses to get up there to help with making sure the coal's on there, but adding water as well, or in those little toolboxes that are up there. There's always going to be a little bit of stain from the water. We're not going to rust it a lot or anything like that, but that's an ideal area to put a little bit of rust if you want. Just like that. We're adding just a tiny bit, because that water sort of stays trapped in that area there. And on the other side of the tender again, highlighting the steps. And we're just trying to bring out these details by doing this. Looks like there's a lot of weathering there, but when this dries, these colors will be very faint. And just along on the ends there. So as a certain amount of dust gets kicked up there, you can add a little bit of tan to represent dust if you want. We're going to come back on this one. We're actually going to spray a light coating of earth on the back. Okay, now here you can see that earlier we had worked on these steps and it looked like it had plenty of paint, but in actuality there wasn't much. Now at the back of the cylinders in the valve gear area there's always stains. A lot of moisture leaks from those sliding pistons there. So that's a great place to put a little bit of white looking. This light gray looks like white when it's on the black for the deposits. It's also a nice area to add just a little tiny bit of rust. You don't want to get carried away with it, but just a little bit of rust back there. Take your time when you do this. It helps to step back, let everything dry for an hour or so, and come back and look at it again and see if you need to make any changes to it. See, like we've gone over these areas before, but just doing it again. Now here on the tender, this is really thin. I stick my brush in the thinner first and then pick up a tiny bit of paint, just putting it on the tender, just small amounts, just where water from rain over the months or the years since the locomotive was painted has allowed a small amount of material to be washed down. Again, you want to do this discreetly. When you're weathering a locomotive, stop often. Look at it, see how it looks. Go do something, come back. Often what looks great when you're working on it, when you come back later, you may realize you've got it too gray or not gray enough. If it's too gray, wash this with thinner and scrub it with a soft brush, and most of that will come off. So we've done the sides, so now we're just working on the end, doing the same thing. Now these stains are very prominent now while they're wet, but again when they dry, they're not nearly as prominent. So just think about areas where the water would accumulate. Again, what I've done is I've taken my brush, dipped it into the thinner first, then picked up a tiny bit of the color. Then often I go back to the thinner again, just to keep this very, very light. You can always add more tomorrow, but it's harder to take it off. So do this very lightly and really think about the colors you use, and just be very patient and work slowly at this. Don't get in a big hurry. Again, we're not trying to paint this tinder gray. We just want some light streaks. This is an ideal way to weather for somebody who doesn't have an airbrush. On this particular model, we're not using an airbrush at all. We're using very few colors even. If you use a little variety, add a little bit of brown or rust color to that gray, that helps a lot, making it look better. When we get up around the cab and the area, we want to do the same thing. We want to think about the moisture running down the side and bringing down a little bit of material that is just gathered there from the wind. One thing you can do is in that area where the engineer or the fireman leans out, they always rest their arms on there. You can put a little bit of a pad there, or show a little bit of extra rust and wear if you want. Okay, again, now we're back at the locomotive boiler again, adding just little bits more. See, as this has had time to dry, I'm able to judge whether I want to add more or not. Now the bands that join the different courses of the boiler together, those are areas, because there's little crevices there, those are areas that pick up different colored dirt and materials and minerals and hold it. So we always want to run a little bit of a highlight just over the bands, just to bring them out a little tiny bit. Again, when it's weathered enough for you, stop. Weathering is a very personal issue. Everybody does it a little bit differently. Working on the cab again, very small amounts, lots of thinner, little tiny bits of paint. And up on the roof, see how that just runs around something like that opening there, that hatch in the roof? Very easy, very small amounts. May have been a whistle at some point on the cab of this roof. This locomotive is from IHC, and it's a nice little locomotive, but it doesn't have near the detail of the modern Bachmann locomotives. The locomotives that Bachmann is making now have so much detail on them. It's comparable to what brass locomotives were back in the 70s when I first started buying brass. I eventually quit buying brass because I was so satisfied with the plastic locomotives. Now here, we're using two different colors of paint. We're using a brownish color, and we're using a dark gray. The particular colors that I used here was Tester's flat black, and mixed in that was some of the gunship gray. And then for the brownish color, I actually used Tester's wood. You can use any earth color. We're just using very small amounts. We're mixing them together, and we're just flowing this over the sides of the Tinder Trucks. Just small amounts. We're not painting them per se. We're just letting the colors with this heavy dose of thinner just sort of run into these different areas, just to provide some highlights on the high points of the Tinder Trucks. Now for paints, I've got two different kind of paints we're trying here. One, as you can see, is from Tamiya. This lighter color spray is Tamiya Light Sand, and the darker is from Tester's Light Earth. Now it's too dark for my taste, What we're going to demonstrate is how we're actually going to spray this. We're going to pretend that white box is our locomotive. And see, we're spraying away from that box. See how as we get closer we get that dark color along there? Well, that's the tester's light earth. If that's the color mud and dirt you would like to have on your locomotive, use that. I prefer a lighter color because where I come from in California it was much lighter. And this light sand from Tamaya is a good example. Notice as I sprayed along how I got a little overspray. See, I spray the paper and just let the overspray hit this white box. There you can see how nice a light amount of paint is there. So again, we're doing the same thing. There we're putting the dark and putting a lot of light over it. Experiment with these two colors a bit before you actually do this next step. Now here, using the Tamaya light sand, if I go along close to the locomotive like that, I end up with too much paint on it. So instead of painting near the locomotive, I want about that far away from it. Let that hit the paper and just let the overspray bounce up. Like that. Okay, see how I did that? I do that again at the back. Just a light amount. And that puts that light amount on there. So that's pretty much the way our locomotive is going to be right now. Now I let this dry thoroughly, and I look at it carefully on all the sides to make sure that I'm happy with it. While this overspray is light, if it's on too heavy someplace, you can wash it off. So as you look at this, you can see we don't have a lot of weathering on it. It's very lightly weathered. This is how many people want to have their locomotives. So here's the illustration, the lesson on how we do that. Now you can always go back over certain areas. Now like on the cylinder chest there on this side, see how much gray got on that, or that light earth? Well, that's a little too much for my taste. So after this is thoroughly dry, I'm going to add and change something to that. Now here's the Neo Lube I talked about. Use a disposable brush. Just brush this right over any of the moving parts and joints. And this puts a layer of black that matches almost exactly that gray. Now this conducts electricity, so don't put it down on your drivers themselves. On one side of your drivers there's an insulated side, and if you brush this over the driver, it'll cause it to conduct electricity and your trains won't run. So here that steam chest was too dark, so I got some black powder. You can get this from Dr. Ben, you can get this from Joel Bragdon. You can even make it from yourself with chalk. If you use the powders from Bragdon or from Dr. Ben, then you don't have to spray an overspray on it to hold it in place. So here I'm just taking this powder and really rubbing it onto that steam chest. Just rub it until it darkens up as much as you like, until it looks right to you. So we've gone from having too much to just right. Next, we're going to talk about cleaning the wheels and the drivers. For cleaning any little bits of paint that you got on your drivers, you can use a Q-tip with lacquer thinner, MEK, acetone. I like to use the liquid cement from Testors. It works fine. Now, I got my hand in the way here so you can't really see. But here I've just put an alligator clip on one of the Tinder Trucks and then holding the other alligator clip against the right driver so that it spins. Now here what I've done is I've taken a piece of track and I've put alligator clips from my power pack onto that, and you can get it to where these spin pretty good. You may have to turn it up quite a bit in order to get it to spin. And normally you're not working on a rotating surface and trying to take a video at the same time, so you'll actually find this is easier. Okay, there we go. Now they're spinning. Okay, we want to get them spinning pretty good like this. And what we want to do then is we want to take a Q-tip with the thinner of the cement on it and just run it across the rims like that. And that takes that paint right off. Keep a lot of Q-tips handy. Use one side to get them wet and clean it, and use the other side of the Q-tip to dry it. That cradle is made out of a box from a Bachmann steam locomotive, and it seems to fit just about everything. Now back on the Tinder Trucks, you want to do the same thing. You want to take a Q-tip, hold it against the rim, and just rotate it with your finger. Again, you're going to find this much easier to do than I am, because I'm trying to do it so that the camera can get in there and see how that's done. See how easy that cleans up? That's all there is to it. So there's your locomotive, all ready to run. This is what it looks like in a layout setting. Let me turn up the contrast a bit here and show it to you again a little lighter. And that's all there is to it. That's a lightly weathered locomotive. The ON30 Mogul from Bachmann is a very nice locomotive, very well detailed. And here I've taken the boiler off just to make it a little easier to work with. And here we're covering some of the paints we're going to be using. These are all Tester's paints, and what we have is flat brown, which looks like a light fresh rust color to me, some International tan, and we're going to be using some gray. Now here I'm pouring a little bit of thinner into a disposable cup just to show you how we're going to be working with this. So I pick up some of the gray and I mix it right into the thinner like this. Mix it right into the thinner. I'm going to use this as a wash to go over the whole locomotive. I'm also going to lighten it up a bit with a little bit of that very light colored, that's called International Tan from Tester's. And just to get away from the pure gray color, I wanted to add a little brown to it. Not a lot, but you can see it changes the color just a little bit. So it's a very good mix of gray and tan. And we're actually just going to paint this over all the locomotive. What this does is this really tones down the black. Like in the opening sequence when the locomotive ran by, you could see that it wasn't jet black, but it was really a lot of different grays. So here, what I'm doing, now you don't have to do it this way, of course. You don't have to put this overcoat on, but I like to do it just as a way of breaking up that jet black and making it a softer gray color. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually going along. After this real thin mix has been on there, it pools up in certain areas along the edges. So I'm just taking, I keep a Kleenex handy, I'm just drying the brush, and there's just coming back and picking up some of the excess paint. Because we're not trying to paint this gray, we just want to have this gray overcoating of everything. Here on top of the roof of the cab, it's where it's the most visible. So I want to take a little bit of extra time with that. After we get that done, then we're going to work on the rest of the locomotive. Just going back into that very thin mix there. Just starting at the upper parts and edges along the front of the cab. Going to work our way along over the entire locomotive. Now I haven't done the sides of the cab so that I have a convenient place to hang on to. Now working at the top, up around the bell and on this air tank, we're continuing to just flow this material on. And it'll just run down into the cracks and crevices and accumulate and help bring out many of those details. Now in this version, in the earlier locomotive, I did not do this. But on this one, I'm giving it a whole coat all the way around just to get rid of that jet black and make it a gray. It'll be a dark gray, but it still won't be jet black. So this will be a little heavier weathered. And we're going to use different techniques in this portion for weathering this locomotive. But again, we want to work it over the whole area. See, it naturally accumulates, like at the bottom of that air drum, in certain areas, and will accumulate where there's joints. And capillary action will hold more of it in, so it'll dry. So it's really a great way just to highlight everything and give us a nice surface to work with. These Bachmann locomotives are really beautiful locomotives to work with. I really enjoy them. And here we can see the handrails in this locomotive are black like they normally are. Not much we can do about the cab detail there that's enclosed in the back. You might want to, on your model, cut away those openings and open that up so that you can bring out a little bit more backhead detail. But since we're not doing that here, we're not really modifying the locomotive, we're just going to go ahead and apply this thin mix. And of course we want it to build up more along on the running boards. Now here I've actually mixed in a little bit more of the tan, the International Tan, because I want this to be a little more tan color. A little bit on the visor, a little bit running down over the sides of the cabs. Again, just a very light coat, not trying to really hide anything. Now that roof, you see that roof has had time to dry. As we're doing this here, you can see what it looks like there. So it looks pretty dirty. So we may want to work on that later after we're completely done doing this. Just want to go around and do this. Now each kind of locomotive has different style of lettering, and on this one here, using this thinner, this tester's thinner, actually causes some of the lettering to come off. So you want to be careful that you flow it on and don't rub. And around the steam chest on the frame and everything, having the boiler off just makes it a little easier to get to everything to show you how to do it. You do not have to take the boiler off of your locomotive in order to weather it. All these steps can be done fine with it in place. I just found in order to get the camera in there so you could see things better, it was a little easier to do it this way. So we want to make sure all the black covers get a wash. All the different areas where we want to bring out the details. Now back under the locomotive, like in the firebox area, we're putting a little bit of wash there. You may want to put a little bit of a rust wash there because that turns rust pretty good. But you'll notice I did not put this wash on the drivers themselves. Now here, using some of the tester's thinner, with this lettering on this Bachmann locomotive, see how it just brings it right off? Just put some on with a soft brush, rub it back and forth. Use a Q-tip is even better. Paper towel like this. Just spend a little bit of time, you can get all that lettering off. That works well for me because I like to add my own. Now here on the front, looking at this reference photo, we see that there's accumulation around the smoke box front. And here we can see a bit of rust. See the rust around that, we got the pretty good there in the area in the center, but around here there's rust. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to show you how to put a little bit of rust, not a lot, but a little bit around there. These books from BHI sure make it easy to see how to detail things. So when we put that rust around there, the way we're going to do is we're just going to let the paint sort of flow into those areas and accumulate. So let's work on that now. Now for the rust color, instead of using rust, I'm actually using Tester's Roof Brown. This to me looks like fresh rust. That's the color I thought was the closest to the color on the smoke box there. You can blend your colors, of course, if you want. But I'm really trying to use them without doing an awful lot of blending. just to make it easy. And I'm using paints that are readily available at most hobby shops. Testers is generally available. Now I'm putting a little bit of the rust on, and I've got quite a bit of thinner in my brush. So I'm loading up with thinner first, then picking up some of the rust, and then coming around and just putting it right along the outside edges like this. Just want a small amount. Right like down here at the bottom. Okay. Okay, get that down to where you can see it better. Just so you can see how thin that paint is. And even then, if you think it's too thick, you can just go ahead and add a little bit more thinner to it, and it'll thin right down, and you can soak up the excess paint down at the bottom using either the corner of a paper tissue, like a Kleenex, or a dry brush that has nothing in it. And just working it around until we get it to where we want it to look just right. Now here I've put lettering on, and these are dry transfers, and often they don't work completely and transfer completely. So you just take a small paintbrush and some testers, white paint, flat white, and you can go ahead and fill in the lettering just the way you want it to be. My railroad is the Patent Mines Railroad, so it's real easy for me to put PMR on there. Of course, I like my lettering to be weathered a lot more. So I'm coming back, and I'm actually going to take a little tiny bit of white. There's quite a bit of thinner on here, and I'm just going to make it look like some of that paint has come off and run down a little bit. You want to use this lightly. You don't want to get overboard with this. It's easy to get carried away. You can do this one of two ways. You can either use a Tester's liquid cement and drag it over the dry transfers and bring it down, or just use some white. Now here on the smoke box, we see that it's silver basically, but there's a lot of buildup of soot. And these have modern ash collectors on the top of the smokestacks, which our locomotives probably don't have. But these modern ones are more efficient than they used to be, so it doesn't weather exactly the same, but it's pretty close. But this is what we're interested in. See how there's different areas, different amounts of soot on the smoke box and on the front of the stack itself. So that's what we're going to address next. Going to use some flat enamel, and this is steel, Tester's steel. And what it does, putting it onto that silver, it actually makes it a different color and gives it sort of a stained look. So we're not trying to match that silver, we're trying to put a slightly different color of silver, and the steel does that quite well. We're just trying to make the stack itself look stained. We're not really trying to change the color at this point. And the same way with the smoke box, just putting little bits of this steel on there just to change the silver look. See how that is? We just want to work carefully at it and just build it up. And you'll notice I'm sort of patting it on. Patting it on that smokestack was better than just dragging it down. And doing a little bit of the same back under the smoke box. It's another one of those areas that the color changes quickly from the heat of the locomotive itself. You want to work carefully here. And if you want to add a little rust to the smoke box while you're at it, that's fine too. And I'm going up around the cylinders there. The cylinders really get heavily stained, so I'm just putting some of that steel color on there just to change that silver that's around the cylinders there. Do that a little bit on both sides, just like so. Now we're going to look more closely here. Now again, we don't have that modern spark arrestor, but we do have gray and almost black as we get down on the boiler itself. So we're going to do our best to simulate that. We're we're going to start with just using more testers paints. We always use flats if they're available. And we're going to start when we're going to use some flat black, and we're going to use some of the gray that we've been using all the way along. That's gunship gray. Now, if you don't find gunship gray, that's okay. These are just the colors I honestly happen to have at home. And these are the colors I just pick up. I used to buy hundreds of shades, but I discovered I just like to blend my colors. Now, where we're working here, I've given this plenty of time for that coating of steel to dry. So here we're not trying to paint this whole thing black. We're just wanting some black stain accumulation, dark gray. This is a mix of the black and the gray. We want different amounts of gray and black on there. And rather than just brushing, you'll notice I'm using sort of a dabbing motion. That dabbing motion gets it on there the way that looks the best to my eye. Anyway, it may not look the best to you, but it looks the best to me. So again, a little different mix of gray. See, I've added a little more gray to that. And just coming back over that area, we want a mottled look. We don't want it to look like it's been smoothly painted. We just want it mottled looking. And by using flat paints, if you only have gloss paints available, you can do this same thing. In fact, you can use acrylics if you prefer to use acrylics. A lot of people use acrylics. I like acrylics. I use them a lot on my own, but when it comes to weathering locomotives, I really like using testers enamels because they're so readily available. They got a good mix, and I'm just very familiar with their colors, and I know just which ones I want and where I'm going to use them at. So again, we're just sort of building this paint up here. We're not really trying to make it thick enough to create texture, but by going over the same areas a couple of times and build it up, it actually adds a little bit of a look of texture to it. And just continue working slowly. Use different amounts of the black and the gray mixed together on your brush. It's a very tiny brush, and just dabbing different amounts on in a different pattern. We don't want any brush strokes. That's the main thing we want to avoid, is brush strokes. We don't want it to look like we've actually painted this on. We want to look like it's just built up and accumulated over the years. Well, the top of the stack, of course, is going to be black, so we want to just do that one jet black. Just like that, just that easy. Now, as you're looking at this smokestack here, you need to recognize I didn't bring that coating of soot all the way down to the base, but I left some of the silver base down there. And I did that intentionally because that's what it looked like in those reference photos we were looking at. Now here I'm taking some of that same mix, putting a little bit around the base of the stack, but mainly down on the smoke box. Because we want that same accumulation of these different colors down on the smoke box itself. A little bit right there at the base, because it would build up at the base, but I wanted a little bit of that silver showing through. And we do this not only on the silver part, but we extend it back onto the black part of the boiler as well. And again, we're not trying to do this real fast, and we're not trying to brush it on, we're dabbing it on. See, it's a up and down dabbing type motion. Putting some there on the framework that supports the light, and beginning to add it coming down the locomotive smoke box, like that. And again, dabbing it. See, I've left that silver at the bottom of the stack. Here I'm just dabbing this paint on there, very small amounts with a very small brush. Just tiny, tiny amounts. Now the builder's plate, for some reason, most railroads kept their builder plates pretty clean. I don't know why, but it's something they did. They also kept the letters on the cab and on the tender pretty visible. Okay, so again, we're just brushing a little bit, but mainly dabbing. Just want it to look like this stuff is just built up there over the years of use. And again, stop every once in a while. Go have a cup of coffee. Go watch some TV. Come back. Look at your model and see whether you want to continue or not. It's always easier to add more paint than it is to remove some of the paint. And again, looking at your reference photos that you have available, just try to copy as much as you can. We did the other side of the smoke box, so we're going to come over on this side, do pretty much the same. Started off by putting a little bit of stain around the base holding the headlight, and just different areas here. We're brushing. As an artist, we actually call this scrumbling. It's a term you won't hear much unless you are around artists, but it's how we apply acrylic paints on landscape painting. And we just sort of dab it on there. Okay, now here you can see how our smoke box front looks. Now our rust that we put on earlier is quite dried at this point, but I'm just going around now with just a little bit of this soot just around the edges, not much, just around the edges here and there, just enough to make it look sort of dirty, but I don't really want to dirty it up too much. Smoke box fronts are fun to do. They're one of those parts of the locomotive that can really be made to look nice. That silver with the darker colors of rust and the soot and the grays and everything, it just makes it very easy to make these look very nice. We don't want to overdo this. We're just trying to highlight some of the nuts and bolts and part of the hinges that hold this smoke box front on. Want to do this very carefully. This is very thin paint that I'm putting on here. It's a wash that just naturally gathers around these areas. And just put a little bit of stain on. Want it to look used, but not abused. Very small amounts, very carefully put on. A little bit on the smoke box front there. When you get too much on like that, just come back with some thinner and come right over it and use a dry brush and just suck up the excess, or the corner of a tissue will do that well. And while we soaked up most of the paint, we left enough there to actually stain it a little bit so that it doesn't look brand new. Okay, and just look for any areas that need a little touch up. Okay, so we're making some pretty good progress here. Now around the bands themselves, soot and dirt really accumulates, so we want to make sure we add a little bit there. Just take the time to really evaluate it, see how it looks. Add a little bit more stain where you feel you need the stain to be. You can look for anything that looks like might be brush marks. Unfortunately, when they cast these locomotive parts, sometimes there'll be a casting line, a parting line from the mold, and that will catch the paint unrealistically. So you got to be careful to avoid those type areas there. So just really think about it, let it dry, and then come back and add some more if you want. But I think we're getting pretty close there to exactly how I think it should be. Add a little color there on the top of the headlight itself. A little bit, not a lot. Again, we're not trying to make it look terribly worn, but we want it to be something other than just a brand new locomotive. As we go through and do these weathering treatments here, we're going to get progressively more and more carried away with the weathering. Now, it's important that you stop when you think it looks good. In providing a clinic for you, I go a little overboard on weathering, mainly because some people really like that look. And if I just show you a very light weathering, then this clinic doesn't help people who like things more heavily weathered. And if all else fails, you can always have at least one locomotive that's no longer in service, that's just on a rip track someplace, that is just severely weathered from just setting out in the sun and the rain and the elements for such a long period of time. Now, locomotives get handled a lot. Boxcars, you put them on the track, they pretty much stay there. Locomotives get handled more than everything else. So we want to keep that in mind as we do our weathering. Once you're all done, if you want, you can take something like a dull coat, Tester's dull coat, and give an overspray to the whole model just to add a little strength to it, if that's what you want to do. Now, this little area here I decided needed a little more work. Now, we're not going to spend this much time on the whole model, but since this part of the locomotive is silver, we just have to give it a little more care than the rest. Now, here I'm going back in and picking up some of the gray, and even though we've washed over this area, I'm coming over now with a little heavier amount. That gray area is dried from before, so now I'm going over it again just to bring out a little bit more heavily weathered. You don't have to add this step if you don't want. You can leave it just as it was before. Now, there on the side of that cylinder, I didn't mean to make that horizontal line, so I'm going back over to brush downward with it. Very small amounts of paint. Be sure to stop, let it dry if you need to, and then look at it. Think about it for a while before you add another coat of paint. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing over on this side. I'm going to put a little darker layer of that gray-black mixture right along, trying to achieve the effect of water and soot and everything washing down the side of these. Here, I'm stroking vertically. You can see that, and trying to get that particular effect there. That's the way to do that. Weathering is a lot of fun. Having done the stroking, then I'm back to doing the dabbing action on different areas of the boiler. Just trying to give the effect of soot having accumulated there, and of course it's runs down the side, so as I'm doing this I'm working my way almost straight down. I'm not working back and forth. See how I start and I work down? I start and I work down, trying as best I can to work down on these materials. Where there's cast on details like some of this piping, you got to remember that in real life on the locomotive it wouldn't be part of the casting itself. That would be separate, so that material would actually wash down behind it. But just try to think of where it would accumulate. And again, always take the time to look at it and think about it and see how it looks. Okay, so looking at the front again, and just trying to get it so it runs down the front like of that air cylinder, just like that. Just trying to get it just so. Again, a dabbing motion, but always working up and down in that dabbing motion. A little bit on the support for the bell. Now the bell actually tarnishes. Brass does tarnish and corrode, but it doesn't. You never want to put very much weathering on the brass parts. So here I'm coming back over that roof again, doing a little bit of that stabbing motion, this time trying to represent soot being deposited there. Before we gave it a wash. And now what we're doing is we're just trying to come over it with the impression of soot being there. And notice I start at the top. Even though I'm dabbing rather than stroking, I do start at the top and work my way straight down the sides as I do this, because that's what we want to do. We want it to be broken up, but we want to work straight down. And the same way with the cab itself. And again, this makes for a lighter, a grayer looking locomotive. You have to be very careful how you do this and how it looks on your layout and in your room. Well, our layouts are much darker than it is outside. We have to be very careful that we don't make our models as dark as items actually are outside, or it's very hard to see the detail on them. The reason we go with the gray here is because the gray allows us to see the detail in the locomotive much better than if it were just straight, flat black. So here, working around those numbers, I don't want that to be too strong, but I certainly want it to be weathered a bit. And now that I'm no longer holding the locomotive by the cab, I can go ahead and add a little bit of soot and everything to the front of the cab as well. Now this is supposed to be a coating of soot that is accumulated. Just work back and forth. It's very important you keep your hands very clean while you're doing all these things. If you stop and eat, make sure you wash your hands. Anytime you take a break, always wash your hands before you come back, because your fingers very quickly develop oils. And when you get those oils on the surface of your locomotive, then it really affects the way the paint attaches to it. And later we're going to be using some powdered colors. And when you use those powdered colors, oil really grabs them, and so you have to be careful that everything you're working with is clean. Some people actually take the shells of their locomotives and wash them in dish soap, a very mild dish soap, just to make sure it's free from oil. I find I don't have to do that. Maybe I have drier hands than most people, but I find I rarely have to actually wash any of these before I actually start working on them. And again, as we're weathering the locomotive, keep in mind the colors of the actual dirt in the areas your locomotive ran. In California, where I lived, everything was tan. Dirt was tan. It was never gray. So I would have, if this were for running in California, it would have more of a tan color to it than it would just a straight gray. Here in Alaska, I find it hard to find scenery materials that I can use on my layout because all the dirt here is gray or dark gray or almost black. There's just nothing a light gray color. Now, as we look here at the back of the locomotive, remember we've already given a wash to this one time, and it didn't affect it very much. So we're just adding some soot coming down, and again, we're trying for those vertical lines here, but still incorporating that stabbing or dabbing motion at the same time. It's too bad that the back of this locomotive is enclosed like this. It was operated in cold territory, so enclosed cabs, those doors right there I'm working on the left and right, actually opened up so that the engineer and the fireman could be protected from the cold to a degree. Another thing you can always do is add curtains to your locomotive as a nice little detail. Now here I'm working back on the tinder, and I'm still using those same colors, And now I'm providing and putting on here, I've already given it that wash earlier. So now I'm coming back over and giving it a pretty good coat of soot and coal dust looking material. That coal, one thing you can do if you want a more realistic looking coal is if you have access to a chunk of coal, actually take a chunk, put it in an old sock, and pound it with a hammer and break it up, and you can actually glue it over these coal loads. These coal loads are shiny, but they still look like plastic. But if you take some matte medium or acrylic medium, it can be gloss medium, and jab it onto the actual coal pile to let it serve as glue, you can put coal on there and it will look very realistic. You can't brush it on to that jagged coal surface there because then it'll just splatter and go everywhere. So just stab some medium, whether it's gloss or flat, either one, and then sprinkle on this actual coal dust that you have from you broke up in the sock, and that'll give you a very realistic coal load. You can put some of that on the front of the tinder where as it would be loaded into the firebox, some of it would fall off and everything. There had to be an accumulation of that inside these cabs. And here I'm still working, going around with, I started with the soot. I'm coming back now with the mixture with a little more of the thinner in it because I want it to be flowing down the sides of these surfaces. The treatment of the sides of your tinder is different than the other areas in that with those large flat areas, the water and soot, when it would wash down the side, would wash pretty much straight down. And just want to continue staining in the areas where the engineer or the fireman or the brakeman would stand. And just go ahead, and we're still using that gray and black mixture and just going around and adding little bits more at a time. Little bit at a time. Again, stop often, look at it, see if you've added too much. If so, take a little thinner to it and wash some of it off, scrub it a bit, and this fresh paint will come off easily and absorb it with a paper towel, a Kleenex, or a dry brush. If you need more, add some more. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at these details right on the drivers themselves. Now there may have been a railroad somewhere that had chrome-plated main rods, but I don't know where. Now what I'm doing here, since I have the shell off of this, I'm taking a little bit of paint. Now this is not the really watered down black and gray. This is pretty much full strength, and I'm just applying it very carefully around on the wheels here, on the spokes and different areas on the wheel. Not a lot. Only doing it in areas that I'm confident that it's not going to get on the surface that connects the track, and I'm not getting it near where the connections between the rods and the drivers are, those rotating pieces. I want to make sure I don't get any paint down into those areas at all. So I'm just using a very, very fine brush, working very carefully, just trying to knock some of that jet black color off. Very careful in applying this. It's one of those areas where if you do this with a boiler on, it's much harder, but it's easy to do it working at it like this. So these locomotives come with this white around the outside edge, and you know, white would show dirt quite a bit more than other areas. So I'm just really taking the time to put small amounts of this soot and coal material right around on the drivers. Again, making sure I don't get, here's a close-up. See, I'm not getting any place near the part that actually has contact with the track. And can you see how thin this is? This is a very thin mix. I'm not trying to paint this white area black. I'm not trying to paint it gray. I just want some very, very light amounts of weathering over it. Just very right along here on the wheels, being very careful not to get any on the rods, and up here on the pilot wheel. Comes jet black. I'm just got a little bit of gray I'm putting in there. Just wash it down in there like that. Let it dry thoroughly before you turn it over to do the other side. Notice I got a band-aid on my hand. This is sort of weathering with one hand. I took a bad fall and caught myself with my left hand. Didn't break my wrist, but came awfully close. So a little awkward to do this, but we can get it done. So if I can do it with one hand, just about anybody can do it. Again, working on the drivers, very, very small amounts of paint. I don't know if you can tell how thin that is, but you can see it's not really painting it, okay? And again, I'm very careful just to get it right on that white part and not down on the surface that has contact with the track, and especially not right where the rods connect to the drivers. Got to be very careful about that. You don't want your weathering to interfere with how well your locomotive runs. So just continue to work on this very carefully, very patiently. Small amount of paint, very small, very thin, and lots of little trips to the paint. See, I put just a small amount of paint on my brush. See, I go back over, I pick up more, come back, work just a little bit like this, then I could pick up more paint, come back and add some more. See, even as we're watching this, see how that paint just sort of automatically disappears? Well, it doesn't really disappear. It's just as it dries, once that thinner's out of it, there's just not much left of that paint at all. One thing you want to make sure you do is to hook up power to your locomotive enough to turn the drivers a quarter turn a couple of times so that you can make sure that you get all of each driver. You don't want to neglect that area back behind the valve gear on this. If you get an area that's too dark, well, you can come back and just pick it up later. We don't want it to be uniform. Now, if you're really fanatical about this, what you should do is take a very fine brush with another coloring and draw some lines out from the center of the driver out towards the outside rim. And what that does, as this driver goes around, the dirt actually is slung out by centrifugal force, so it works away from the center of the driver out to the ends of the rims. Hard to detail, hard to show that, and nobody really notices it, but if you really are working on a contest model or something like that, put that detail in and be sure to write it on the form so the judges know it's there. Now what I'm doing here, I'm coming with the paint, and you'll notice I'm not painting right where the drivers connect. I'm just painting these drive rods with this, it's a grayish black mix. Again, this is the mix of the flat black and the gunship gray, both by testers. And I'm just painting the different parts of the valve gear, the drivers, painting a little bit on the brake shoes there that show. But we're going to come back, we're going to put Neolube, just like we did in the last weathering segment. We're going to put Neolube on here to blend these colors together, and just so it doesn't interfere with how this runs. Just any part where we think that the paint is not going to interfere with the operation of the locomotive, I want to put just a little bit of paint on there, because chrome-plated drivers and drive rods just did not exist. See here, we've had a little bit of time for that paint to dry, and it's add just a little bit more weathering on those drivers. As this dries, it always looks like there's a lot going on there, but when it dries and the thinner is gone and everything, usually you find it's not very dark at all. Now here, I'm taking some of the gray, and I'm mixing it with some of the flat international tan from Testers. Just making a grayish-brown mix, no particular color, but by just putting a very fine wash on the sides of the trucks. Very fine wash. That brings out those little details on those trucks quite well. You can see the springs and everything like that. Now, if these were actual springs that were in here, like are on some the old Central Valley trucks in HO, you'd want to be very careful about the amount of paint you'd put on there. But here, anytime we're just putting these trace amounts of paint on, it's not really going to affect the operation. So we're just flowing that on, and we want to make sure we do it all. Just putting highlights on there and bringing out some of that very fine detail that we see. If you enter your contest in a model, if it's an MRA contest, they have sheets where you explain what you've done. Be sure to point out all these little different things that you've done on your locomotive. Now here, in this area here, this is where the firemen and the engineers spend a lot of their time walking around. So that's always going to be pretty well worn. So what I'm doing is I'm taking some Testers silver and some of that gunship gray, and I'm mixing them together. I'm not using either one straight, and I'm just dabbing it on in this area here. This would represent where the boots they've been wearing has worn through the paint. If you put just silver, it doesn't look right. The silver has a glossy look to it. You want a certain amount of the silver in there, but you don't want to just paint it silver. You want it to look like it's worn and dirt has accumulated and the coal has been ground down into it. Now that area I'm painting is a good place to put a little bit of glue after you're all done. A little bit of glue and a little bit of fine coal dust, because often there would be lumps of coal right in that area there. It's a fine little detail. I don't take the time to put it on this video, but that's something that you can add, and it will add a nice look to your model for sure. Coming back to the back of the tender, I'm going to put a little bit of that right on the handle. You lift that handle to add water. Of course, we're going to add a little bit of silver on the handrails. Now looking here at the back, using these reference photos at the back, we see there's it's not perfectly smooth, and on some of them there might be a little bit of rust. So that's what we want to try to duplicate. We want to try to duplicate that on our drivers. So what we used was this is Testers Rust, and we're going to put a little bit of that rust. Sorry, this is dark. This is one problem in filming something like this is a very dark, when you try to film things that are black, see, my skin color there is about right, but it's just hard to see sometimes what I'm doing on the black. So what I've done throughout the video on these different ones is I've manually set the exposure so that you can see what I'm doing a little better. Here it's just sort of hard to see. We're just adding, I'm just putting traces of rust color right around this area where they fill it with water. I'm not trying to put a lot there. And then just a little bit of rust right on the surface of the tinder, because it would rust in that area there. Put a little bit on, add a little bit of thinner to it to wash it around. Very easily done. Very nice little detail to have there. Now often what happens is the water will run to the side, either to the side or it'll collect in these areas. What happens is the locomotive, when it has a fresh load of water and a fresh load of coal, that tinder may not set flat. It may sag a little bit in the back, in which case the water will go to the back and accumulate. Or when it's running light, it may go to the front and may accumulate there. Now I'm putting just a little bit of the rust color right here on the coupler. You don't want to put enough to interfere with the operation of the coupler for sure. And the same thing at the front of the locomotive. Very small amounts. Now this coupler doesn't work, so you can add a little more color to it. But just working a little bit on that. And just a little different areas where you think there might be some rust accumulating. You don't want to put a lot of rust on this. Just very, very tiny amounts. Now, along the front of the pilot there, it comes in a silver color. And this is something I've noticed on the Denver Rio Grande Western locomotives. They use silver a lot along on the edges of the pilots and in different areas where they needed to make sure that people could see it easily. So they use quite a bit of silver for contrasting colors. Here I'm taking some of that gray-black mix with a little silver in it and just putting a light coat on that front pilot deck, right where the fireman and the engineer and the brakeman would walk at different times and stand, where they would grab a hold to lift themselves up onto the locomotive as they were climbing up on it. Just little small amounts. Now again, this picture is very dark, but this is really about the color of the locomotive. As I'm sitting and looking at it, I adjust the color at different points on these different videos in order to get the intensity of the light just right. If I set it for just automatic, I get some really weird colors. One thing you'll notice is that sometimes the gray I'm using will have a blue tone to it. Some of the other colors, the light tan might have sort of a yellowish tone to it. But here I'm just working very lightly, a little bit of that silver right over the spokes of the pilot, just to bring them out. Now I'm going around and I'm looking at different parts on the locomotive. This is really primarily gray, and I'm just going over some of these fittings and some of the piping, just so that that detail pops out a bit. Now, you don't want to paint these bright silver or anything like that. You don't want to really draw attention to the fact that you've painted them. What you're doing is you're just putting a highlight on there. A lot of the gray, very thin. It's a dry brushing technique for sure. Just going over some of these different pipes and parts. Just bringing out those details a little bit. You don't want to get carried away with this. You want it to be very subtle. You want to recognize that it's important that these details they give us on these locomotives, that you can see them. But on a black locomotive like this, you can see that just adding a little bit of highlight makes those parts pop out much better, and you can see them much better. Just that little bit of time and effort. Again, very, very tiny brush. very small amounts of paint, very similar to the actual black, just a little bit lighter than that. And then you can go back and highlight that again with a little bit lighter gray, and the handrail, same thing. Just brings it out, makes it pop out. A little time consuming to do these type of things, but your locomotive's not very big. So here where the people step, I want to add just a little bit of silver there, a little bit more. We'll make it a little bit more of a worn look. And when they'd step up, they would step up to this area here. Now when these colors dry, it's not going to be nearly as pronounced. It just looks quite a bit darker with the filming here. Very nice. Okay. Now, different areas we just want to touch up and add. If you discover there's too much, you can take black paint and go over it, or you can just soften it with thinner and absorb it with a paper towel, or you can even take some of the black powders available from Bragdon's and Dr. Ben's and just scrub over the surface. Now here in this photo, we can see the handrails on the prototype are silver. And we will see there's a little bit of silver in different areas there. And here on the ladder, see the ladder at the back? See how that's painted silver? And the handrails are silver. They do that for visibility, to make it safer for their firemen and brakemen to climb all over the locomotives. So when we're detailing ours, we want to make sure they do it. Here's an easy thing to do, is just take a little bit of wood and sand it down and paint it, glue it on there. The engineer built himself a little armrest, a leather. Now this is Neolube. This is the black graphite material. Again, use a throwaway brush. Don't try to clean this brush after you're done. You're just wasting your time, so make sure it's a cheap brush. And we're putting it on those areas. See, right where the driver joins to the rods, we want a lubricant there, and this works great. This is as good as oil, but it's the same color as we're using, or very close to the same colors we're using. So you can put it on there, and if it ever wears off, you can just add some more. Now here's the little tins of different colors, from black and different grays and everything. The model at this point is completely dry. I've let it dry overnight. So now I'm just coming back with some of these powders. Now these powders, you can get them from Bragdon Enterprises. You can get them from Dr. Ben. I know both Joel Bragdon and Richard Bendever. I see them a lot at train shows. Got a lot of respect for both of them, and they both make these powders. And these powders are not like chalk used in school. When you put it on and you scrub it in place, it stays there. And when you put this stuff on, it makes for a dusty look. So you want to make sure your locomotive is completely dry. And then you just want to come back and add some little dusty areas like this. Dust it on, and then scrub it. Don't put a lot of this on. Once it's on there, you're not going to get it off. Trust me on that. So now you'll notice I'm putting this dust down at the bottom part of the tender and on the trucks. I'm not going up on the upper part. This kind of dust accumulates from turbulence, stirring up fresh mud, from passing trains, from here like on the ends. This would be from the trucks and the freight cars behind it, actually kicking up mud and dirt. See, so I'm concentrating that, not all the way across, but right where the dirt would be kicked up from the trucks on the freight cars in the front. Now here at the front of the tender, again, there's going to be a small amount kicked up from the drivers. So instead of doing it all the way across, just do it there. And then put some of that dirt right there where the guys work. Add a little bit of black. And you just want to mix there. This is going to be very dry and dusty, and this is a pretty permanent stuff. It's something that's only come along the last 10 years or so, but once you start using it, and a little bit, you can see I'm not even, how much am I using there? These little tins are going to last me the rest of my life. And, oh, you want to make sure you spread out a newspaper or a paper towel when you do this work, because this gets really, really messy in a hurry. You want to make sure you're not doing this on any nice furniture. You're going to get it on your hands. You're going to get it on your shirt. No matter how careful you are, you're just going to end up getting this stuff on. So wash your hands thoroughly afterwards. And again, do it on a paper towel so that you can just fold that paper towel up when you're done. Even opening these little boxes, you got to be very careful. So I'm just putting these different colors and see a little bit of a rust color around there. And it just makes for a nice powdery look, and then you just scrub it in. And you continue around on the locomotive looking for different areas. Now around in the smoke box area, a lot of rust accumulated. It's too bad that we can't get to the smoke box on this to do a little better detailing job. Smoke box is one of those areas I really like to work on. But here for this one, we're just put a little bit of that rust color back there on the smoke box. Just scrub it in. You don't have to worry about it getting down to where the drivers are or anything. It's just not going to mess up the drive. Some of this powder, put it right on the drivers themselves. It's very thin. The excess gets brushed off. I'm just putting just tiny amounts on this brush. It's a pretty stiff brush. You want to not use a soft brush for this part. You want to use a stiff brush. And you can see here, this is where the value of applying power to your locomotive and turning your wheels on your drivers every once in a while, so you can get in there and do this type of work. Because you don't want, as your locomotive goes along, you don't want dark light, dark light, dark light. You want it all to be uniform. Put some on the cylinders. A little bit of rust. See, a little bit of rust goes a long way there, and add some black to it. Now if you get it too red, now on the steam chest there, let's say that I had gotten that too red, well, you could just come back with some black and put it on there, and it would tone it right down. Want to make sure we get back up under the running boards on the boiler. And again, we're primarily doing this on the lower part of the locomotive. So it's a little different color on this side than it was on the other, adding a little bit of rust on the drivers themselves, putting a little bit of this powder. Now what I use to blow off the powder when I'm done, if you got an air compressor, you can use that. But I go to Costco and buy cans of air propellant. It's actually designed for electronic work, and it's you should take your computer box off every once, the outside shell on your computer, and blow it out every once in a while. You can do that once you're all done here and blow this stuff, but be aware, if you're doing it inside the house, wherever you blow it, that's where it's going to be. Now I'm taking some of the black and doing right up on the smokestack and around in the area there, so that there's some of this powdery soot looking black, in addition to the colors that I painted on there. A little bit on the different domes, a little bit on top of the air cylinder, on top of the cab. You can just rub it in, and this really gets rid of a lot of those earlier looks that we had. When you look at that, if you can think back to where when I first washed the light gray over the top of it, it certainly looks a whole lot different now. Just continue adding it along on the boiler and everything. This gives a nice sooty look to everything. You may not want your locomotive to be this weathered. It's a very personal decision. But this is how I like to do things. And this is quite a bit more heavily weathered than that HO mogul that we did first. Just continue along. And I want some of that very light color just applied in certain areas. Now that light color, that's about the color of dirt where I come from in California. A little bit of rust right around the coupler pockets. Follow up with a little black to tone it down. We want very subtle colors here. And just rub it. Rub it, rub it. Now here's some of the air propellant used for cleaning computers. And I just spray it like this and it just blows all that dust off. Just be careful, because when you blow it off, you don't want it to blow it off onto your couch or something like that. I have a room devoted to doing these videos, so I can make a pretty big mess in here without it hurting anything. Okay, so there's our locomotive.